Hello folks, it's Mr. Huffman and it's not Levi because this is my mini lesson and I'm very excited for it and I hope everybody does well on theirs as well. So my perspective lesson will be, as you can see, on the United States and its role in global conflicts. So this follows the NCDPI Essential Standard AH2.86.2 specifically, which asks to explain the American involvement in these conflicts. So this lesson would be for an American History 2 class, 11th grade American History 2 class, and will be structured as a lecture, which I'm about to present, and a debate activity that would also inform and accompany a class-wide anchor chart activity. I'm going to explain more about those at the end of the lecture, as I will be explaining it for the students. So throughout the lecture, I would, of course, allow time for questions and any sort of discussion that will be able to be had. But for now, for this mini lesson, I'm just going to kind of go through it at a good pace. So, all right, are we ready? Let's go. All right, class, I hope you've all been having a good week, and I'm looking forward to our lecture and lesson today. So, today we are talking about the United States and global conflict. Now, for the purpose of this lesson, this is going to be a kind of summary for a lot of lessons where we will go more into depth later on about these individual conflicts. But for now, it's kind of a summary of the causes of the war, which this lecture will inform some activities you'll be doing throughout the rest of the lesson. So, the definition of a global war or conflict is a war that involves multiple countries across the globe, that usually concerns principal nations. The United States of America has been involved in many various global conflicts over the past century. But however, this expands beyond the classical definition of a world war as seen above. It can encompass something as big as World War II, or something as kind of narrow as the CIA's involvement in the Soviet-Afghan War, or some of the kind of South American wars of the 1980s as well. However, for the purposes of our discussion today, it's just going to be best for us to simplify the study of these major conflicts in the United States and their causes, so just the kind of really big conflicts we're going to be talking about today. All right, so the first one we're going to discuss is the Spanish-American War, which took place in 1898. And this was concerning the Cuban struggle for independence from Spain, and that was proving negative for American investments. Now, to fully understand this war, we're going to need to understand something called yellow journalism. How many of us have heard of yellow journalism? A couple, good, okay. So basically, it's journalism that is based upon sensationalism and exaggeration. An example of this that's very important for this war was the sinking of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor, which Americans blamed on Spanish ships, although this was never proven. But it was used as a sort of propaganda to bring the United States into war with Spain. And of course, this was yellow journalism, right, class? Yes. Okay, so this kind of yellow journalism, along with the will to limit Spanish colonialism in the region of Cuba and that area, led to American involvement in that Cuban struggle. So moving right along, World War I, which we were in at the very end of the war, primarily from about 1917 to 1918. And the reason for this was because we were practicing neutrality and isolationism throughout the majority of that war. And we all know what neutrality and isolationism is, correct, where that's the idea of maybe we'll give some aid, some weapons or certain things to these countries that are at war, that are our allies, but we're not going to put troops on the ground. Of course, this changed when German ships sunk the American liner, the Housatonic, and 4 other ships, and President Woodrow Wilson decided to end that neutrality to help end the war in Europe. World War II, which we were in from about 1941 to 1945, which was the majority of the war because it began in about 1939, was very similar to the First World War in that the United States was doing its best to practice as isolationism. However, this would not last as the Japanese war with China was costing Japan natural resources, and that led it to invade French Manchuria for oil. French Manchuria is kind of the area of Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, that kind of area, and we'll talk more about that later. But the United States decided to enforce further sanctions on Japan for this invasion as a result. Now, after much debate, that's all very complicated and complex, the Japanese decided to strike the sleeping giant while it was asleep, of course, and attack the American naval base at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, in retaliation for these sanctions. Of course, there were official declarations of war that came from Japan and Germany, and the mission for the United States in World War II was to end continental discord in Europe and Asia. Moving right along, the Korean War in 1950 to 1953 concerned the threat of the Soviet Union and the global spread of communism following World War II. This is, of course, one first of many proxy wars that occurred during the Cold War, which we all know about, right? And we're going to discuss that in a very big way in future lectures. Now, one important term that we need to realize going forward with this war and the next war that we're going to be talking about is the domino theory. How many of us have heard of the domino theory? Okay, good. This is, of course, the belief that if one country falls to communism, others would soon follow. So it's like dominoes, right? So China fell to communism in about 1947, 1948. And North Korea sort of fell to communism after that. So there's a belief that, if all of Korea fell to communism, it's like a dominoes, right? Vietnam would fall, possibly Japan, possibly other nations, and it would go on. And then communism would spread globally in a very fast rate. So this was all, of course, due to Russian control over North Korea after World War II, as well as Chinese influence in the area, and that led to the communist takeover of North Korea. So the North decided to invade the South to institute it as a part of its communist nation. However, America decided to intervene under that domino theory to stop that spread and preserve democratic ideals in South Korea. Now, of course, this is very, very similar to the Vietnam War, as we saw that the North was communist in the Korean conflict and the South was democratic. It's the very same thing in the Vietnam War. So the domino theory, once again, to stop the spread of communism in Asia was America's major aim. Vietnam, we were involved in Vietnam from about 1955 to 1975, that's 20 years. But we did not really put troops on the ground in a big way until about 1964, after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which we will go into a lot more detail in our Vietnam lecture. But it was basically the idea to preserve democracy in South Vietnam from the invading North Vietnamese army. So we decided that as our American troops were to destroy North Vietnamese and Viet Cong resources on land and by air. As you can see here in the photograph, all the napalm that was used a lot, and of course all these kind of air cavalry helicopters, and of course ground troops. All right, jumping far ahead into a far different region is the Gulf War, which is also known as Persian Gulf War, First Gulf War. For purposes of our lecture, we're just going to call it the Gulf War, which took place in 1990 and 1991. And it involved the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait due to oil pricing and production disputes under the leadership of Saddam Hussein, or the Iraqi leader. And they destroyed a lot of oil fields, which caused a kind of international uproar. And this led to the United Nations coalition, which was spearheaded by America, to sanction the Operation Desert Storm, which was, as you can see there, the planes, aircraft, a lot of bombings and certain things like that started the Gulf War. And then this, of course, would be later accompanied by Operation Desert Shield, which would be a more ground-centered part of the conflict. But the United States and the United Nations coalition worked to protect Saudi Arabia from an invasion from Iraq, as well as to drive out those Iraqi forces from Kuwait and preserve Kuwait as a sovereign nation. This, of course, worked. Although George H.W. Bush, the President of the United States at the time, as for our purposes, we'll call him Papa Bush or Daddy Bush in this class, he did not want to root out Saddam Hussein as a leader because he felt that it would lead to a lot of power vacuums and discord, political discord in the nation. This would later lead to a lot of complications in the Iraq War, which took place from about 2003 to 2011. Now, the Iraq War is very complicated. I'm going to try to explain it as best I can. But we all remember September 11, 2001. Well, I don't actually remember it myself. I was alive at the time. I was about 3 years old, so I don't really recall it. And many of you, I believe, are too young. But we all know about the attacks on September 11th, 2001 by Al-Qaeda terrorist group, and what a trying time for our nation that was. But the United States believed that Saddam Hussein and Iraq either were harboring terrorists or were in league with those terrorists to carry out further attacks on the United States. So the United States, along with their war in Afghanistan that was going on at the time, decided to remove Saddam Hussein and institute a democratic government in Iraq, basically the invasion that never happened in the Gulf War. They also hoped to disable possible weapons of mass destruction. And all of this, we will talk a lot more in detail about the Iraq War later on and all of the complications that occurred. Okay, so for our group activities, students, we will all be getting into groups, and so let's say Group A would be World War I, Group B would be the Vietnam War, and so on and so forth. Now, in each of these groups, you will each be getting, and I have the information sheets here I'm going to hand out with all the more specific instructions on this, but you will each be getting a certain nation within that conflict, an individual viewpoint from one of those nations. So let's say for World War I, someone gets France, someone gets Germany, someone gets the United States, Britain, so on and so forth. You will all research on your computers about the reasons for that nation's interest into the war, its kind of missions, its goals, its viewpoints. And then you will all, and I have the specifics as far as the exact research you need to do on these sheets, but then you will all debate those reasons and sort of points of view within your group. Through that debate, you will all come to an agreement on the three major reasons for that war occurring. Once you've determined that, we will all come together as a class and go through each and every group, and everyone in that group will list off their reasons. Following that, we will all come together as a class and create an anchor chart, which I have an example of here. And the anchor chart, of course, it doesn't have to look exactly like this, but the main kind of reasoning for it is so we can list off every war and put those kind of reasons for that and causes within that war there. So it's a good way to remember. It's a sort of organized chart, graphic organizer that will make it a lot easier to understand these reasons. So I've got all the sheets here, and I'm going to call off everyone's name as far as what group they will be in, and we'll get started. All right? Good. Okay, that was the lecture. Thank you for listening to that. I hope it was well. So basically, as far as guided and independent practice goes in this lesson, the class is overall a guided practice. However, as the lecturer, and I will be assisting in the formulation of the anchor chart. But however, the students will complete each of their roles. They will research, and that will be sort of their independent practice because I will be taking up that research at the end of class for an individual grade for each of them. So to close out the lesson, I'll place the anchor chart at the front of the room so everybody can see it, and I will summarize what we have all learned throughout the lecture and the research and the formulation of the anchor chart, and reiterate the question over America's involvement in global politics and kind of the questioning of that. So I hope that was good. I cut it down to the wire there, but I think I got within the time. And I hope everybody enjoyed, and it's been a great semester and a great class. And thank you, Dr. Cabasco, for all your help with us. And I'm looking forward to next semester. See you guys then.